the president of the European Commission has promised strong countermeasures against US tariffs. Ursula von der Leyen described tariffs as bad for business and worse for consumers. Donald Trump signed orders reinstating 25% charges on all steel imports on Monday. He also raised aluminium tariffs from 10 to 25%. The levies are due to come into effect next month. Well, the US is the world's biggest buyer of steel, and President Trump's new tariffs make no distinction between allies or indeed economic rivals. Early reactions from US trading partners range from dismay to plans to retaliate.
The Canadian city of Windsor, Ontario, is just across the border from the US. The movement of goods back and forth has been seamless. But now, a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum threatens to change that. Entrepreneur Brendan Lane supplies parts to American car manufacturers.
One part can cross 3 different times, and we bring the raw material in, we form it here, and then it would go off the heat treat, and then we send it across the border to get plated, then it comes back to us. In the end, someone's going to foot the bill, and I don't know who that would be.
Canada is the largest supplier of steel to the US. It's followed by Brazil, the European Union countries, and Mexico. In Asia, South Korea is the most affected, but Vietnam, Japan, and Taiwan also export significant amounts to the United States. Economists fear the impact of increasing tariffs on global trade. China has already responded with retaliatory tariffs, and the European Union is also preparing for a trade conflict.
The EU sees no justification for the imposition of tariffs on our exports, which is economically counterproductive. And we are currently assessing the scope of the measures announced overnight and will be responding in firm and a proportionate way by countermeasures.
In addition to tariffs on steel and aluminum, Donald Trump has also announced reciprocal tariffs. This means the US plans to impose import tariffs on all products from countries that impose tariffs on US goods. That's a tit-for-tat approach.
All right, let's start with Europe and our correspondent, Lucia Schulten, who joins us from Brussels. Welcome, Lucia. What can we expect from the EU beyond strong rhetoric?
Yeah, we have heard very clearly that the European Union is going to answer to this. Ursula von der Leyen has said that unjustified tariffs will not be unanswered, and they are looking for a proportionate but firm response to this, as we have also heard by Maroš Šefčovič just right there in the European Parliament. So the European Union now still is looking into what the exact answer will be. It does seem likely that this will be also tariffs or countermeasures in some way. Experts are saying that it might be, or that it is likely that maybe old tariffs that have been suspended right now might be reactivated. Just as a short reminder, during his first term, Donald Trump has already imposed tariffs on the European Union, also on aluminium and steel. And back then, the European Union did respond with tariffs on US goods, such as on jeans, motorcycles, but also peanut butter. And these tariffs have just been suspended. So it might be, but it is not said yet, that these might be reactivated. One last point that Maroš Šefčovič just made also in the European Parliament, he was saying that this is not the preferred scenario, so that the European Union does stay open to constructive dialogue, and that they would like to rather solve this in an amicable way by talking about it. And one chance might be a meeting later today between Ursula von der Leyen and Vice Presidents J.D. Vance. They're both at the AI summit in Paris, and they're set to meet today during the day.
Be interesting to be a fly on that particular wall. Thank you for now, Lucia Schulten in Brussels. Let's get a wider perspective from Meredith Crowley. She's Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge in the UK and joins us from there. Welcome to DW, Professor. Let's start with that proportionate but fair EU response. Is that likely to change Donald Trump's mind?
I suspect it won't. I think in terms of negotiating tactics, President Trump likes to keep quite closed what exactly he's looking for until the negotiations start. So I suspect that, putting tariffs on the U.S. the idea on the European side is to inflict some pain on some domestic U.S. groups, such as, say, peanut butter producers, big farmers of peanuts, and then have them bring pressure on the president. I think that, in the last round, tariffs on China threatens tariffs on soybeans. President Trump just used domestic taxation to kind of solve that problem by transferring a lot of income to soybean producers. So I'm not sure retaliatory tariffs are are going to be as effective as the European Union would like them to be.
Okay. So how does this end? Because we have two sets of tariffs wandering around at the moment. We have the ones that he imposed last week, and we have these against everyone. So let's deal with this latest set of madness. How does this end?
Okay, so first of all, with the steel tariffs, what happened in 2001 when President George W. Bush imposed tariffs on steel was the first response came from U.S. producers who need steel. So if you make a bridge, you make an automobile, you need steel, you need it from sort of high quality source like Europe. And so in that phase, when we had these high steel tariffs put on in 2001, industry by industry, product by product, country by country, where U.S. domestic producer really was hurting and had to, say, reduce employment because they couldn't produce cars because cars became too expensive. That was one of the things that incentivized President George W. Bush to start removing steel tariffs. Ultimately, the WTO compelled the U.S. to remove them in that case. So that's one scenario. Another one is that, President Trump has something else in mind that he seeks from the European Union. He hasn't made it, explicit yet. Potentially, he wants some support for, the U.S. Position on the war in Ukraine. He could instead want the EU to join the U.S. in an aggressive stance on trade with China. So there are potentially other things that he's seeking, and those could lead to a gradual removal of tariffs. The other thing, you mentioned this idea of reciprocal tariffs. In some sense, it is a fact that the U.S. tariffs under the WTO are very, very low and much lower than most of the U.S.'s major trading partners, such as the European Union and Japan. So, for example, the U.S. tax on cars is 2.5%. In Europe, the import tariff on autos is 10%. So he's going to raise the American tariff on autos coming from Europe to 10%. Hoping maybe the EU will then say, okay, well, you know what? We'll lower our tariff to 2.5%. So he's thinking about these industry by industry deals. And maybe if he can get a sort of political win and making it look like he's cracked open a market by getting the European Union to, cut tariffs, that might work. But that puts the EU in a tough position, because if they did that, technically it's a violation of WTO rules. And the European Union is a big supporter of the rules-based multilateral trade system under the WTO.
Okay, so the president's promise to the American people is that these tariffs will help American consumers. What's your assessment? Will they?
No. Full stop. No, they will not. They will raise prices for U.S. consumers. People who buy the most imported goods are people who can't afford to buy expensive services like vacations. So lowest income people in the U.S. will experience the most harm from all of these tariffs. Really rich people, if the price of a car goes up, they'll still be able to buy a new car every few years. If you're someone who's just struggling to pay for the, not very good car you have right now, it's a much heavier burden. If the price of an auto goes up, $1,000, your family just won't be able to buy one. So the costs of these tariffs are going to be very heavily borne by lower income people in U.S. society, who in large measure have voted for President Trump.
That's very clear, Professor. Thank you for talking us through that. Professor Meredith Crowley from Cambridge University.
Okay, thanks very much.
Well, Inga Fechner joins us now. She's a senior economist for Germany and global trade at ING Bank, and joining us today on the line from Frankfurt. So we have steep U.S. tariffs on aluminum and steel coming next month, including on EU products. How do you think the European Union should respond to this?
I think it's quite remarkable that the European Union already issued a statement even before the official announcement stating that those tariffs would be unfair, that they would not be in line with trade rules, with deals. So they really are in for retaliation. They really are in for the long game. They do want to accept those tariffs from the US as they are regarded unfair. So the EU probably will reinstate those tariffs that they slapped on US goods back in 2018, on whiskey, on bourbon, on jeans, on motorcycles, etc. Back then it was in the range of 10% to 25%. Now it is rumored that those tariffs could go as high as 50%. So that is likely an easy and a quick step that the European Union will take.
Now, I'm curious if you tell us a little bit more about what happened the last time we saw steel and aluminum tariffs from the Trump administration in his first time in office. How bad was the damage then to EU economies?
Well, European economies, they do not export that much steel to the US. So at least in terms of values, if you look at the overall trade value, it only makes up some 1.5% of exports to the US. So it is quite okay from that point of view, but of course it does hurt steel and aluminium manufacturers here in Europe. But I think it's rather that the European Union really wants to show that they can retaliate, that they do not see this as a fair practice from the United States, that it's rather about indeed this level playing field, about rules, and not so much about the damage per se to the economy.
Now, Trump has said there are going to be no exceptions to these tariffs, but he, of course, also likes to use leverage with tariff threats to strike deals. Do you think there is also wiggle room this time around?
I think so. Already it's rumored that Australia might get an exemption. It's the same thing that we've seen back in 2018. So there were pretty quickly deals with Argentina, Brazil, for example, also Australia. Other countries were not that lucky. But I think that there is still room for negotiation. We still have some 4 weeks before those tariffs really enter into effect. The question, of course, is what is his ultimate game? So what does Trump really want? Is it really about negotiation? Is it about some better conditions? Or is it rather about this national security, about really bringing back domestic manufacturing back to the US? And is it ultimately also about tax revenue? So we don't know that yet. But I think for some countries, there will be exemptions for sure.
And if there aren't exemptions, could you just put a finer point on this for what exactly that will mean for European consumers? I mean, how will it affect people's day-to-day?
Yeah, the biggest threat, of course, is the retaliation. So for importers, it gets more expensive in the US, but then, of course, also for European exporters. And when the EU now slaps tariffs on US goods, it means that ultimately also the European consumer has to pay more for US goods, which he will feel in his pockets. He also, of course, the European consumer can say, I just simply won't buy US goods anymore, but that also means less choice. So in the end, no one really benefits from a trade war. All sides will be worse off.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. That is Inga Fechner, a senior economist for Germany and global trade at ING Bank.
Thank you.